Eloquent is definitely one of Laravel's most important features, and it's also usually the feature that people either really like or really dislike. It is curious because it is an active record implementation, so it works both on the database layer as well as on the application layer. So not only does it accesses your database and fetch and write records, but it also represents database records all in one class. This isn't a problem, but rather a design decision on active record, the pattern in which Eloquent implements. And on this video, we're going to dig down a little bit into Eloquent's internal implementation and see how it does all the magic that's necessary to provide such a good developer experience and allow us developers to do all the things that we do with it. I apologize for my voice on this video. I'm a little bit sick and also got a little bit of a brain fog, so I'm just not on my prime. But I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and of course, any suggestions or complaints, leave it on the comments, and see you on the coding area, or rather the rest of the video. See ya. Alright, so I'm using the same application that we've used on the last test-driven development video. I only made one slight change. So we have users, which comes with Laravel, and we have a post table, which has a title, a body, and it belongs to a user. So basically, users can create posts. That's the schema that we have right now for the examples I'm going to show you. To make things easier, I've created a couple of fake records on the database. So we have about 20 posts and one user. That's going to be useful when I want to show you relationships and queries and whatnot. But we're not going to use that right now. I've written this doc, which we're going to use to support the explanation. Like I said, Eloquent does a couple things. It accesses the database with all done it. For instance, when you call post all or post query get, you're doing a read operation on the database. You're interacting with the database, and after that, you're getting a collection of records. Each instance of a model also represents a record from the database. Okay, there might be situations where it doesn't, for instance, an unsaved record, but what we have in memory is usually in sync with the database. If you have an unsaved model on your application, you're probably going to save it at some point. Eloquent also persists objects into the database. When we call post save, for instance, we're doing a write operation on the database. And it also queries relationships. So when you have an instance of a model, that is a record from the database, you can query its relationship. So you go back into the database layer. Now, Eloquent does much more than this, but we're not going to touch all it does on this video. We're going to focus on those four things. Here are some examples of what we can do with Eloquent. We can fetch all the posts. That's pretty standard. We can query something on the database. For instance, we could fetch all the posts where the title is, let's say, complaint, something like this. And this returns a query builder instance. We're going to talk about this a little bit later. Now, you can also omit this query method and call where directly, or you can actually call any query builder method directly. And you can also use query scope. So if we go into the post model, we have this query scope is complaint, which just matches the title to the complaint string. We can call this as well. Now, here's what's interesting. This looks fine. This looks fine. We have auto completion. Now, this one, my IDE is complaining. It says that the method wasn't found. And indeed, it isn't. This method doesn't exist either on the post class or the model class that the post extends from. Same thing for the Same thing for the query scope. We don't have this method. It is actually called scope is complaint, and it is written slightly different. We have an uppercase I here, and we have a lowercase I here. So how does Eloquent works internally to allow us to do this? Well, let's start with the database layer. How does Eloquent query stuff? How does it know when you should query stuff? And what does it do internally? To do this, we need to jump into the Laravel's code base a little bit. I'm going to hover over this, and I'm going to press Shift F12, which on my key binding goes to definition. So let's see how this function is defined. You can see it is a static function, so we cannot call it from an object context. And here's what it does. It calls the query method and then calls get. So this is the same thing as doing post query get. It is just proxying the call. So you can get that all of the way. Now, what this query does, that's what's being called, so it must be important. If we jump to the definition, well, it instantiates the model. So in this case, we would be doing, we're doing new post query, something like this. And then that's it. That's all it does. Now, if we go back to new query, it does a couple things. It registers global scopes to a given query builder. We're not going to cover global scopes now. If you want to take a look at the code, you can see it's pretty simple. It just iterates through the global scopes and applies them, but we're not going to touch it now. If we go to the new model query method, you can see that it returns an instance of Element Database Eloquent Builder. Now, this is interesting. Let's go back to this document. We have a couple classes that we're going to leverage here. The first one is the model class, extended by the models. The second one is the base query builder. When you call, for instance, db table post get, this is on the query builder instance. We also have the Eloquent query builder, which is what we're talking about. And then we have relation classes. So when you return a has many or it belongs to, they extend this relation class. Okay, so in this example, you can see that we are passing a base query builder as an argument to this new Eloquent builder. If we see the code, you can see that new Eloquent builder returns an Eloquent query builder, right? If we take a look, you can see that we're talking about database Eloquent builder. Let me go back to the method we were looking for, which is new model query, and it passes a base query builder as an argument. If we take a look at this class, you can see that it accepts a query builder as an argument. It does not extend the base query builder. Instead, it implements this builder contract. So it uses composition to bring in the methods available on the base query builder. And you can see that we also have a mixing doc block here to indicate that we have this class's methods available on this class. If we check the constructor, sure enough, we have a base query builder instance being expected here. So that already gives us a clue of what's going on. Eloquent has its own query builder, which is built on top of the base query builder. And we don't know what it does exactly, but if there's a class specific to Eloquent, it must do certain things that Eloquent needs without having to rewrite or overload the base query builder methods. Well, to sum it up, we call this set model method, and it is available on the Eloquent builder class. So it just sets the model that we pass. In this case, we're passing the actual object. We would be passing post, in this case, an instance of post. The reason it does this is because, as you can see, the query builder stuff is not actually on the model class. It is on a separate Eloquent builder class. And we need this class to be aware of which model we are talking about. So if we go all the way back and we go back to this method call query, we're just returning this new query, which is an Eloquent builder. So the magic happens on this class. Now you might be thinking, okay, but how can I write this? And okay, the IDE is complaining, but we know this works. We know for a fact this works. Well, that's one of the magic, quite a lot of magic that Eloquent's doing for us. If we scroll all the way down and look for the magic methods on this class, let's take a look at the call and as well on the call static as well, which is right here. So call static is just proxying this call to call. Actually, it is instantiating the model and calling the method. Now, if the method doesn't exist on the object and you have a magic call method, it is going to go into this block. And you can see that we're going to ignore this. But at the end of the day, it is forwarding the call to a query builder instance. So if we're calling a method that doesn't exist on the model itself, what Eloquent does is, okay, so this isn't available here. This must be a query builder method. And then it forwards the call to the query builder. Forward call to is a trait available in Laravel. This isn't the only piece that uses it, but like I said, it just processes the call to a given object, and if the method is not available, then it throws a bad method call exception. I'm sure you guys probably stumbled upon this exception at some point, especially when dealing with model methods. But this is what it does. So the important stuff is actually here. And on the Eloquent Builder class, we can see the same thing happen. If we go all the way down to the call magic method, this is what we are interested in. So remember we talked about scopes, right? Here we have a scope example. This method doesn't exist, but it still works. And this happens on this block. First, we have a method to determine whether a scope exists. Remember that what this magic method is getting on the method name isn't actually isComplain. I'm sorry, isn't actually scope isComplain. It is getting, let's see if we can edit this. The method in this case would be isComplain. But the method that exists on the model is scope isComplain. So not only do we have scope at the beginning, we also have an uppercase I. How does Laravel determine whether we have that scope? Well, let's take a look. It defers it to this hasNameScope method on the model. Remember that the Eloquent Builder is aware of the model we're talking about. If we take a look at this method, well, here's the magic. It checks whether a method that starts with scope and also has an uppercase first letter with the actual scope name exists. So it would be checking whether scope isComplain exists. So here's how the magic happens. If we go back to the call method, you can see that if the scope exists, then we want to call it. And then Eloquent applies the scope. Now, we're not going to worry about the pass-through methods here, but basically there are certain methods that we just want to defer straight into the query builder. But on this case, this is what we want. So if we call a method on the Eloquent Builder class, remember, this class doesn't extend the base query builder. It doesn't use inheritance. So let's just double check it so you can see it just implements this builder contract. What it does is if the method isn't available on this class, then it must be available on the class it extends, not directly with inheritance, but the base query builder. So it forwards the call to the base query builder as well, just like the model does, using the same trait, which is forwards calls. And then once that happens, then we're talking about the builder class. Find it. This is Eloquent. So this is where it is being deferred to, being proxied to. And this is the base query builder class that we use when we call, like I said, this. Here we're using the base query builder. So at the end of the day, everything is just being passed through objects. When we call post all, it is actually calling post query get. When we call post query, it is actually returning an Eloquent builder. When we call something directly, it is actually passing that call to a query builder as well. And when we call a query scope, it is also being proxied to the query builder. In this case, we already have a query builder in this instance from this point moving forward, but it still has some logic to intercept that method call. It knows it doesn't exist on the model because it was given to the the call magic method. And then it checks whether the scope exists following Laravel patterns. So that's basically what's going on. We have model, which sends it to the Eloquent builder, which then defers what's needed to the base query builder. Okay, so now we know how Eloquent queries stuff. But how does the model aspect of it, the representation of a record from the database, work? Well, that's much simpler. There isn't a lot of magic here. So when we have an instance of model, we're talking about this class, and we have access to all the methods on this class. Now, there are some database operations which are proxied to the query builder, but what I wanted to talk about is relationships. So what do we call, for instance, let me give you an example. We have a post, right? When we call post user, this is a property. This isn't a method. We do have a user method, but we're calling it a property. And if I run this, it fetches the user, right? Now, one more thing. If I have a post and I'm going to enable the query log and I call the user through that property and then I check the query log, you can see that a query was made. However, if I do this again, well, no query was made. What's going on? So if you've worked with Laravel a little bit, you know how this works. What we're doing is something called lazy loading. We call a relationship. Laravel detects that it isn't stored in memory, and then it fetches from the database. Once it fetches the relationship from the database, it saves it to the memory so that if we happen to request that relationship again, it is already cached and we don't have to hit the database more than once. I'm going to show you guys how that is implemented. Well, the first thing we got to look for is the model method. We're talking about a property, so we're not going to look for the call magic method, but the get magic method. Here it is, and you can see that on the get magic method, it is simply proxying the call to this get attribute method. Let's take a look at it. Okay, so we have an attribute to get, which is the key, and let's see what it does. So the first block of code checks for attribute mutators and casts. So we're not gonna touch on those now, but if you've ever used Laravel, you've probably used those as well, especially with dates. Then we have a block to make sure that the base class, notice that it used self class instead of a static class here, has the method. In this case, we don't want to do anything. And then it gets the relation value. So Laravel already knows that if we're calling for a property that isn't on the attributes, and we have this check here, that isn't being casted, and that isn't available on the base class, then we're talking about a relationship. So this is the last possible scenario. It checks for a bunch of stuff first. If none of them match, then well, this must be a relationship. And when we go into the get relation class, notice this if block. If the relation is loaded, we're not going to look into the underlying implementation. Otherwise, this video might get long and confusing. But if the relation is loaded, then, well, we just need to return it from memory. It is cached. If it isn't a relation, then we want to return no. We have this prevents lazy loading block, which is interesting. If I think this was introduced either in late Laravel 8 or on Laravel 9, I can't remember. But basically, when we do, remember what I told you about lazy loading? Let's say you have a for each block and you're iterating through hundreds of users, and then you're grabbing their posts. If you lazy load this, you're going to make hundreds of queries. That's called the n+1 problem. And in Laravel, you can eager load stuff. So for instance, if I want to get all the users with all their posts, I can say user with posts get. And you can see that it already came with the posts. So those are already loaded with a single query. In this case, two queries, one for the user and one for the posts. And I don't have to load this dynamically as the loop goes. And then I can avoid the query problem. Now, those are a little bit tricky to spot. And Laravel released this feature where you can disable lazy loading. You can say, hey, Laravel, if something tries to be lazy loaded, if something tries to be loaded and it isn't in memory, then just throw an exception. And that helps the developer know where they're fucking things up if they don't want lazy loading to be present. So that's a very nice addition, and we can see here how it is handled. This method throws an exception. Well, if nothing goes wrong and you can actually get a relationship, it goes the get relationship from method. Let's take a look at it. So first, it calls the relation. On this post case, it would be calling the user method. And this returns an instance of belongs to. Now, belongs to extends relation, which is this class we talked about. So what Laravel does is if the instance, if the object that we got here isn't an instance of a relation, then something is wrong. And it isn't a relationship instance. So you might have stumbled upon this exception at some point. It isn't that common, but it happens. Now, if it is an instance of relation, then we can get results. We're not going to look into the underlying implementations, but it fetches the results and then it sets the relation results on the model. It caches those results. So if we call something twice, we only query the database once, and this is where it happens. So I'm going to test this and show you guys how this works. Let's create a new relationship here. We're going to call this, I don't know, owner. And it is going to return an instance of post subscription, which is a mailable. I think this one requires, it requires an argument, so we're going to pass the current instance. So if I try to access this as a property, Laravel is going to think we're talking about a relationship, but it is going to stumble upon this if block and throw us an exception. Let's take a look. We refresh Tinker. I'm going to grab the first post. I'm going to say post owner. And okay, my color scheme isn't helping, but it says logic exception. Owner must return a relationship instance. So Laravel is very smart, and it can let you know when you're doing things wrong and helps you avoid those scenarios. So at the end of the day, we have this. We have the data access layer, which is proxied to the Eloquent query builder, which proxies some calls to the base query builder. We have the representation of a record, which is the model itself, and we can call methods within the model just fine. They're not going to go through any magic methods. Relationships, well, those are proxied to the relation class. I mean, the object that we get on this point. So we use it to get the results. One interesting thing to notice is if we go into the relation class, you can see that it also implements the builder contract, and it also accepts a Eloquent builder instance as well as a model. So the relation class is aware of the model we're talking about, and it is aware of the query builder. So it acts as a query builder in its own. So like I was saying, relationships goes through the relation object. Oh, I think this is what I want. And that's pretty much it. Now, one interesting thing is, since on the model, if we go to the call magic method, we're not going to look much into it, but you can see that it also forwards the calls into the new query builder. So one thing that you can do with Eloquent, even though you shouldn't, but that this design allows is you could fetch the first post and you can get a query builder instance from that. You can say post where ID 3 get. See that I'm calling this on a post instance on an object, and syntax error. Okay, this was my mistake, and I can get that instance. So you shouldn't do this, but you can do this, and the reason why you can do this is because calls are forwarded to the query builder. A good way to think of the whole Eloquent ordeal is from a class level, from a static level, you're talking about a query builder, you're talking about database access. From an object level, you're talking about a record representation. Even though you can call relationships which do query the database, but in general, a good way to think is if you're talking about it on the static level, if you're calling static methods, you're probably querying the database. If you're talking about a model instance, you're probably talking about a record from the database. Now, you can use, for instance, dependency injection with models. You can do stuff like on your controllers or any class that you have, function, something expects a post, and on the post you can query stuff. You can say where's something, blah, something like that, and it will work because of what I just showed. I don't have it open anymore, but we have the call magic method proxying stuff through the query builder. So here we are actually talking about an instance of post. The container is going to resolve this for you. Even then, I would still think of it as query builder on the class level and record representation on the object level, even though you can query things on the object level as well. That was the video. I hope you guys managed to learn something with it. I hope it wasn't too fast or too confusing. There's a lot going on behind the scenes on Eloquent, and not only do I not know all of it, I wouldn't have time to show it on a video, especially a short one like this one. But I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I hope you guys managed to understand how it works behind the scenes a little bit. And I think this is very important. You don't have to know the entire underlying implementation, but it's certainly good to know at least how things are proxied behind the scenes so you can properly understand your code and understand how things should be done. For instance, you might still do things like this, but it is important for you to understand why the IDE is complaining about this query method, or why it is complaining about this query scope, or why you can leverage custom query scopes, which I have a tweet about this, and Alex from Code Course has a course about this as well. I'm going to link them in the description. How custom query builders can help you still have query scopes, but avoid this kind of problem. Anyway, I think this video is long enough. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and see you in the next video.